So Anthony Horowitz has just released the name and the cover of the latest James Bond novel, which will be published this May. So I thought it was a great opportunity to do a little trip back in time and rank all 9 of the authors who've written James Bond continuation novels. Hi, it is me. I am back again with a nice pint of beer to talk James Bond books, my favourite subject. Anthony Horowitz, who is the current author for the Ian Fleming Foundation, has just announced the new cover and title of the 3rd and final book that he has written as a sort of continuation of the character of James Bond. And I thought that was a great opportunity, actually, to look back at all of the authors who have continued Ian Fleming's legacy and written books about James Bond since his death in 1964. And there are actually 9 different authors who have written official James Bond books that continue the James Bond saga. And some of you might think I'm miscounting there, but when I do the ranking of the 9 different authors, I am deliberately not going to include 2 of them. 3 of them, I guess. I'm not going to include Kate Westbrook, who is, her real name is Samantha Weinberg. She wrote the Moneypenny Diaries, a series of books which I suppose could be considered continuation novels because they feature Miss Moneypenny and they actually feature James Bond. But because they're about Moneypenny, I didn't really think it was a good idea to include those in the continuation novels. The other one that I thought I should exclude are the Young Bond series. Now, those were originally created by an author called Charlie Higson, who is a fantastic comedian, and they are amazing books. If you haven't read the Young Bond series, I thoroughly recommend them. Charlie Higson started that off and wrote the first batch, and then an author called Steve Cole continued the Young Bond series. I think the last one was, it was only a few years ago since it was published. And they're great books, but because they are not continuation novels, they're prequels, I don't think we should include them in this list. So let's get started. Looks here, there are 9 different authors who have written James Bond books. I'm going to start off with the lowest ranked author. And number 9 is Christopher Wood. Who is Christopher Wood, you say? Which books has Christopher Wood written? Well, Christopher Wood is a screenwriter. He's not just any screenwriter. He's the screenwriter who co-wrote The Spy Who Loved Me and Moonraker with Richard Mabon. And when those 2 movies were released, as was very common in the day, Eon decided to publish novelizations of the films, which seems a bit weird because they are films named after novels. So you have a novel that gets turned into a film that gets turned into a novelization of said film. It actually works in the context of The Spy Who Loved Me and Moonraker, because The Spy Who Loved Me, Ian Fleming very clearly established that he did not want a movie made based on his book, The Spy Who Loved Me. So that movie contains pretty much no element whatsoever from the book upon which it took its name. Therefore, when you wrote a novelization of it, it would be a completely different story. And it made sense for them to pick Christopher Wood, since he was an established novelist and he had already written the screenplay along with Richard Mabon, so he wrote the novelization of The Spy Who Loved Me. And the same thing happened with Moonraker. Even though Moonraker was the name of James Bond book, they basically took no elements from the book, which is a pity because it's one of the best of the James Bond books. They took almost no elements, and again, Christopher Wood wrote a novelization based off his screenplay. And it's kind of interesting. Christopher Wood clearly it was kind of a cynical decision, I think, when they did this. And Christopher Wood is better known as a screenwriter than an author. People of my age might remember these super cheesy, racy-like comedies called the Confessions series, and he was famous for writing those. He also wrote a number of novels under a number of different names. So these books, to me, they're kind of like a cynical cash grab tie-in. Not saying that Christopher Wood didn't do a good job. I remember reading the book of Moonraker at the time, and there were certain elements in the novelization of Moonraker that were kind of lifted from the novelization of Moonraker, Ian Fleming's original novel, there was one scene in particular where Bond was trying to escape the blast of the rocket, and in the book he got quite badly burnt in that. In the movie, of course, it was Roger Moore. He escaped without a single injury, but in the novelization, Christopher Wood actually makes a point of James Bond getting injured by it, and he has some quip like, "I hope you like your men, well done." So, you know, they're not remotely bad books, and if you find them lying around in a second-hand store or something, they're worth a read. But he's definitely my lowest ranked author in the continuation of James Bond. Let's move on to number 8, and that is John Pearson. And again, some people might be like, John Pearson, he didn't write a continuation novel, did he? Well, he kind of did. So John Pearson, if you don't know him, was formerly Ian Fleming's assistant when Ian Fleming was working for the Sunday Times. And he is probably most famous for writing the first and definitive biography of Ian Fleming, The Life of Ian Fleming, which was published in 1966. He also wrote James Bond, the authorised biography of 007. I have a copy of it sitting around here, or so I thought. And, okay, I apparently lost it. But a lot of people aren't aware of this book. But it was a really, really interesting conceit. So, John Pearson wrote a biography of James Bond as if he was a real person. And the problem with that, of course, is that some of the things that he wrote were clearly, you know, fictional. So John Pearson came up with the idea of James Bond 007 being a real person, and Ian Fleming being hired by the British government to write outlandish, wild, steamy novels about James Bond, to fictionalize his espionage, and therefore the Russians and the Americans and everyone would think, oh, this story about this agent 007 stealing nuclear secrets or something, that's just a book that this guy Ian Fleming wrote, it's not real. It's a really, really cool conceit. I really, really enjoy it. And the thing about the authorised biography of 007 is it kind of fits in neatly with the timeline of like a James Bond you can imagine being in action. It kind of wraps up with James Bond's retirement. So it's a great book. I'll tell you what, if you don't have a copy of it, or if you haven't read it, and you're a Bond fan, I definitely recommend doing so, because it really sheds an interesting perspective on Bond as a literary character, and also a character existing in the time of the Bond movies. But yeah, it's not really a continuation novel, so that's why I ranked it at number 8. I do think it's a great book though. Okay, number 7 is going to come in with a surprise, I think. John Gardner. Now, John Gardner is perhaps the guy who's best known for the James Bond continuation novels. In 1981, the company owned by Peter Janro Smith, which is Guild Rose Publications, authorised the first like official continuation of the James Bond saga since Colonel Sun in 1968, and they chose John Gardner to write it. It was called License Renewed, and it was basically about James Bond sort of stepping out of temporary retirement. Boy, how many times have we seen him do that? To go off on a secret mission, and of course he was a spy conducting espionage in the 1980s rather than the 1960s. And it worked quite well in the context of the movies as well, because obviously Roger Moore was not getting any younger at this point. So you kind of imagine a guy of Roger Moore's age getting up to all of these crazy inventions. And I remember reading these books as a young kid, and they're a lot of fun. Roll of Honor was the first one I read, and there's not a lot that I remember from it that really like stuck with me, except I do remember he won a lot of money and he bought this big Bentley Mulsanne Turbo, which is a beautiful like 80s chunky Bentley type car, and I got outraged because we were like, what do you mean it's an automatic? Because young Rubish me, I didn't know that Bentleys only came in automatic. I thought that you could choose between manual or automatic. Anyway, really enjoyed it. I also remember reading License Renewed, and I enjoyed that. I remember, I'm a car guy, so I remember these things. He drove a Saab 900 in it, a Saab 900 Turbo, which is a pretty nice 80s car. There's quite a sweet car there. And he went on about how, you know, it could easily be converted to ethanol because of the gas crisis. The gas crisis that apparently is still going on 50 years later. I do like these books, and they played a very influential part of my childhood growing up and my love affair with Bond. However, John Gardner is number 7 on my list for a number of reasons. The first thing is, it did start to get kind of ridiculous. He very, very strongly committed to this is the same James Bond that you read about in all of the books written by Ian Fleming. And so we're in the 80s now. James Bond was an old man, and it meant some of the things he got up to were increasingly ridiculous. There was one bit for Special Services where he ended up sleeping with Felix Leiter's daughter, and I was just like, yeah, that was really awkward. And do you remember another bit where he was pretending to be an American military officer, and he was trying to pretend that he was a World War II vet? It was just like, it really pushed the boundaries of believability. The other thing that John Gardner did that I wasn't a huge fan of is he tried to expand on James Bond's character. And one of the ways he did that was make James Bond a big jazz fan. I mean, when I say big jazz fan, like really big jazz fan. Like there was one scene in one book where he was listening to the Muzak in the elevator, and he knew exactly which jazz song was, and he had that pressing on vinyl at home, and I'm just like, really? It's a bit of a stretch, man. And I can understand now why John Gardner did that, because Ian Fleming was actually a huge jazz fan, and he'd been on American television talking about particular pieces of obscure jazz he loved. But Ian Fleming never made James Bond a jazz fan, and so that was a really weird detail that kind of didn't gel with me. The other one is John Gardner had overcome alcoholism, and it was a big part of his life. He even wrote a book about that, which means one of the things that I enjoy about literary Bond the most is the booze. Because Ian Fleming writes with almost like erotic sensuality when it comes to the things that James Bond drinks, and I appreciate that. I always felt completely flat when I read the John Gardner books, because you could tell he didn't have that same relationship with alcohol. You could argue he had a healthier relationship with alcohol, but to me that just didn't make them as fun. So that is why he is number 7. Now number 6. The next 3 on the list, I'm going to say it starts to get a bit tricky. Number 6 is Geoffrey Deaver. Now, Ian Fleming Publications commissioned Geoffrey Deaver to write Carte Blanche in 2011. It was the first and only James Bond novel that he wrote. Geoffrey Deaver is a brilliant crime and mystery author. He created a series of books about Lincoln Rhyme, who is a detective who was paralyzed from the neck down. They made a great movie about him with Denzel Washington playing him. He's a fantastic writer. And it's really difficult for me to criticize Carte Blanche because it was a great book. I really enjoyed it. The reason he's number 6 on my list, and we're really getting to the stage now where it's feels difficult to me. Makes me feel bad to kind of like rank one author above the other, because at this point I'm like, all of the authors have written books that I absolutely adore. I picked Geoffrey Deaver as number 6 because he's an American, and that's fine, there's nothing wrong with that, but I will say the character of James Bond has always been so personal to me because class has kind of been wrapped into the whole thing. Ian Fleming came from a family that was like lower upper class. It was just on the high end of like middle class, but just on the low end of the upper class. It's this really weird social structure that you have in England that is difficult to explain to anybody outside of Great Britain. And it was the same background that I grew up in, very, very much so. You know, we existed in, my family was raised in the same social circles as kind of like the Fleming family. So those require a lot of nuance to describe, and as an American I don't think Geoffrey Deaver really got that, which is fine. The other thing was the very deliberate choice, I think, to kind of reboot Bond, and this was Bond for the 21st century, and so the book was set in a contemporary thing, which was interesting. And it was just after the release of Casino Royale, and I think it was the same year that Quantum of Solace had been released. So, you know, movie Bond had been rebooted, so it made a lot of sense to kind of like reboot the literary Bond. It made even more sense because it was kind of ridiculous that Bond was expected to be the same character who had fought in World War II. Now it was the 21st century. However, the way it worked from this point on, it just kind of, it felt like they were writing a book about a completely different character. They should have called it like The Son of Bond or The Grandson of Bond. It was a really, really good book. I just want to say Geoffrey Deaver is a wonderful author. I really enjoyed the book. it kind of worked as a fantastic spy adventure. It just, to me, wasn't quite a Bond spy adventure because of the fact you were reinventing Bond, and when you reinvent a character, he becomes a different character. So that's where he is. That's where he is on my list. Which brings us on to the next on the list. We are at number 5, and number 5 for this choice is William Boyd. And this is where it gets really, really tricky for me, because William Boyd and the next author on the list, I would say it's difficult to pick between them. I think I can't sit here and say that one is better than the other, because you can't really improve on perfection. The authors I'm going to mention afterwards, like beyond that. But William Boyd is just a wonderful, wonderful writer. He's a Scottish writer. He was born and raised in what is now Ghana. And he's most famous for writing a wonderful book called A Good Man in Africa. And the interesting thing was, it was then turned into a movie. He wrote the screenplay for it, starring Sean Connery. And like, Africa is a really big part of William Boyd and his contribution to what James Bond is. And of course, my parents are married in Africa. My brother was born in Nairobi. Africa is a country I have very strong, pretentious, not in any way legitimate a love affair with, having never been there. One day I want to, but I know it was really, really interesting that William Boyd's African heritage got brought into this. And the other thing that he does that is really, really good is this point where we're now elevating the authors to a point where really none of them, it's difficult to rank them because they're all so good. He set his book, Solo, his one and only book, just 6 years after the end of The Man with the Golden Gun. So The Man with the Golden Gun was the final book that Ian Fleming wrote. 6 years afterwards, the events of Solo, and it sees James Bond as somebody who is aging, somebody who's older, somebody who's been through a lot. And William Boyd does a wonderful job painting the picture of Bond as he is really nearing the end of his tenure as a secret agent. And there was a lot of criticism for that, and I know that William Boyd says, he describes it, he said, the Ian Fleming estate provided benevolent surveillance on his writing, and there was some real friction between the two, because William Boyd had written about a James Bond who was like an assassin, who was a killer, and the Ian Fleming Foundation apparently kind of wanted to push down on that. Although if you think about it, James Bond is an assassin. Now that's it, he's a blunt instrument, he is an assassin. You get your 00 status from assassinating people. So I'd almost lean on William Boyd's his take on Bond there. He writes the book brilliantly. If you read it, it's like reading Fleming. It really is very, very good. And the other thing I really liked about it is William Boyd lent quite heavily into like the sensual sides of Bond in terms of like the drink and the food. And Bond was a very heavy drinker, to the point where, as you'll experience in your 40s if you're not careful with your drinking, it might have negatively impacted his life in some way. So yeah, it was a very, very real, authentic portrayal of Bond. I liked it a lot. I think it's a terrific book. And I kind of place it at the same level, or I place William Boyd at the same level in the Bond ethos as the next author on the list. Number 4, Sebastian Faulks. Sebastian Faulks is also a wonderful, wonderful writer. And it was very weird. It was 2008, was that? Anyway, it'd been 6 years since Raymond Benson's last continuation novel of James Bond, and it was the 100th anniversary of Ian Fleming's birth. So the people at the Ian Fleming estate were like, we need to have a Bond book. And so what they did is they reached out to Sebastian Faulks and said, will you write a James Bond continuation novel? And Sebastian Faulks was, I believe the Americans call, hot shit at that time, because he had written this wonderful literary book called Birdsong. And I think it was a fantastic choice of author. He decided to write a book that was set in 1967, just after the events of The Man with the Golden Gun. So it kind of fit in as well with William Boyd's book, which was set later. And it was very, very much written in the style of and in the spirit of Ian Fleming. It's a great book, and I think Sebastian Faulks was a very appropriate choice of author, because he was a literary author. And the thing about Ian Fleming is, his brother was a novelist. Ian Fleming came from literary tradition, and I think he was always kind of ashamed of the fact that he wrote more genre fiction, or he described it literature with a small L. even though the things that are best about literature came across in Ian Fleming's writing in a big way. And so I remember being very, very eager to buy Sebastian Faulks' book, and I read it, and I really enjoyed it, and I could see that his skill as a writer, or his I would say describe it as artistry as writing, and I'll explain why in a little bit, really came across, and I think he did a fantastic job. So between him and William Boyd, it is very difficult to tell. I loved both of those books, and I thought they were brilliant, but they didn't make the #1 spot. We're at number 3 now, and number 3 is kind of a subjective choice. It is Raymond Benson. Now, Raymond Benson was selected to write the continuation of the James Bond adventures in 1997 after John Gardner retired from doing that. And I remember this because I was super, super into James Bond in 1997. That was really like my coming of age. And in Playboy magazine, they introduced Raymond Benson as the new writer of the James Bond books by publishing a short story. And I remember having that edition of Playboy, because Ian Fleming was first published in Playboy. Ian Fleming's James Bond books were published in Playboy. Playboy has had a very long love affair with James Bond. And so it was a really, really appropriate way to introduce Raymond Benson. And it was, I think, Blast from the Past, that was a story. And it was a good story. It was weird. It was about James Bond meeting his son, who he obviously fathered in You Only Live Twice. And it was a kind of blend of the style of the movies, but also being true to the literary tradition of James Bond. And this point in 1997, Raymond Benson made a deliberate choice to kind of continue the idea of James Bond being the same character from the original novels, which was really, really stretching the credibility at this point. But it worked. I've picked Raymond Benson as number 3 because I was super, super into James Bond at this point, and so I eagerly bought every single novel he wrote, and I really, really enjoyed every single one. I mean, to me, they were as much sowing the seeds of my love affair with James Bond as the movies were, because we had GoldenEye, and then we had Tomorrow Never Dies and stuff like that. And interestingly enough, Raymond Benson wrote the novelizations of certain James Bond movies at that point. But they're just great. They're really enjoyable books, and they have so many interesting ideas. And I've put them at number 3 here because, I mean, truly, you know, one day I would like to meet Raymond Benson and shake him by the hand and say thank you. Because of you, I had the seeds of James Bond sown in my heart, and they've never gone since. And it has given me so much joy in my life to be into this stupid nerdy obsession of mine, but I loved it, and Raymond Benson's books were really, really important. And so you could argue that, like William Boyd or Sebastian Faulks, maybe they should be ranked higher on the list than Raymond Benson because of their literary pedigree, but for me, Raymond Benson owns a piece of my heart when it comes to the literary Bond, and so I put him here as number 3 because I just like him, even though he's American. So there we go, giving Jeffrey Deaver a hard time. Raymond Benson is an American as well, but for some reason it never bothered me in the same way. Not that it really bothered me that Jeffrey Deaver was American, but it just never leapt out. And there are certain things that Raymond Benson did that, you know, just other authors can't touch. Like he wrote, my favourite book of his is High Time to Kill, and he wrote about the Gurkhas, the Nepalese special forces who served with Great Britain, and their home is in Winchester in England, which is the city I was born in. So it has a real place in my heart. Raymond Benson has a little corner of my heart that you can't encroach on. So thank you, Raymond, for all of the wonderful things that you've contributed to my life by writing the wonderful books that you did. However, no, he's number 3 on my list, and at number 2, I have to give credit where credit is due and say that my choice is Anthony Horowitz, the current the author of the James Bond books. He's going to have written 3 James Bond books, and as much as I love Raymond Benson, like Anthony Horowitz, it's difficult. Writing is a craft, not an art, and Anthony Horowitz is truly a master craftsman. I recently read and reviewed Forever and a Day, and it's funny, the thing about Anthony Horowitz is he writes his books so deliberately and carefully and with such craftsmanship, like a craftsman creates a beautiful table. Anthony Horowitz takes elements and sews them and weaves them together and puts them together and assembles his books in such a masterful way. I would say my biggest criticism of Anthony Horowitz as an author of the James Bond series is that he is better than Ian Fleming. It's literally that. It's like I read Forever and a Day, and the writing style that he put into it was so breathtakingly accurate to how Ian Fleming wrote, and yet the plot had more structure than Ian Fleming's books often did. He's masterful at what he does. He really is. I'm going to be very sad if this is his last novel, which I believe it is, coming out in May. But he's brilliant. He's not number one though. Number one is a very special spot for the man who wrote the first continuation novel. In 1968, the Ian Fleming Foundation published the first novel after Ian Fleming's death, and they had an idea. They were going to create a pen name, Robert Markham, and they were going to have authors come in and write James Bond books, and they would be published under the name Robert Markham, even though they would be different authors. And they only managed to do one book in that style, and they picked Kingsley Amis to write the next James Bond book. And Kingsley Amis had quite a relationship with James Bond and Ian Fleming as a whole. He wrote two books about James Bond. The James Bond Dossier, which was a critical analysis of James Bond. It was a fascinating book. And then he wrote The Book of Bond, and he didn't publish that under the name Kingsley Amis. He published that under the name Bill Tanner, who of course was M's chief of staff, and it was kind of like a tongue-in-cheek a spoof of James Bond. He also critiqued the manuscript of The Man with the Golden Gun prior to publication, and to be honest, I thought he actually contributed to that manuscript, which is why I thought there was such a seamless sort of a writing style. Apparently they didn't actually end up going with any of his comments or edits. But Colonel's Son reads like an Ian Fleming book. It's brilliant. It's dark, and it does things that are unexpected, but I think Ian Fleming was dark and did things that were unexpected. Colonel's Son, to me, is such a strong book in the James Bond continuation thing. It's so strong as well that like certain elements, like certain lines of dialogue were lifted entirely and used in Die Another Day, to the point they actually credited Kingsley Amis in the credits of that. And also, scenes like the torture scene were actually kind of lifted and adapted and used in Spectre. So he is the Bondian Bond who ever wrote a continuation Bond novel, and he is number one on my list. But saying that, as this video wraps up, as I have 2 minutes left on my battery, they're all amazing. They're all wonderful books, especially the last 6 when we go through. It is difficult to decide which author is better, to rank any of the authors, because they all bring such beautiful, wonderful things to what James Bond is. This is quite a subjective list, and I mean certain things like, you know, what William Boyd contributed with Solo, no other author could. And again, Raymond Benson provided things that have made such a difference to my life that no other author on this list has. I'd say you can't really rank these authors because what they do is also brilliant. And I'm just grateful to have had 37, I think, books telling the continued story of the secret agent that I love. Anyway, got to wrap this up. I will speak to you later, but hopefully this was an interesting video, and I will make another one soon. Thanks so much for watching that video. Don't forget, I've sold nearly 67,000 copies of my novels, so if you want to find out a bit more about that, don't forget to click the subscribe button.